So we're going to go ahead and get started. And I would like to welcome you to Goal-Oriented Assessment Practices, the third talk in the Faculty Professional Development Lecture Series hosted by Academic Affairs. This is the final talk for the winter 21 semester, and the lecture series will resume again in fall 2021. Today, we're hearing from Nadine Ashton about the overall assessment process at CCS, then on a departmental level from Kim Harty, and lastly, assessing an individual class by Ryan Ansel. There will be time for question and answer period after Ryan's presentation, so let me go ahead and introduce our speakers. First up, we have Nadine Ashton, Dean of Academic Affairs. She graduated with a BS from the University of Akron and a Master of Education from Kent State University. She joined CCS as the Director of International Student Services from 2000 until 2003 and was the Director of Academic Advising and Registrar from 2003 to 2018. Since 2018, she served as Dean, and her responsibilities include assessment, accreditation, curriculum, and faculty initiatives. She has participated in the Higher Learning Commission's Assessment Academy, a 3-year commitment developing institutional learning outcomes, program learning outcomes, and course outcomes. She's also coordinated an Educating the Educator campaign. Kim Harty, our next speaker, is Chair of Craft Material Studies and Section Head and Assistant Professor of Glass. She has a BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design and an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Her work investigates materiality and the connection between craft and performance through sculpture, installation, video, and performance. Her work has been widely exhibited, including in the Toledo Museum of Art, the Chrysler Museum of Art, and the Corning Museum of Glass. Prior to teaching at CCS, Kim taught at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Oxbow School of Art, and Penland School of Crafts. Lastly, we have Ryan Ansel, who is Associate Professor and Chair of Advertising Design. He has his BFA from Savannah College of Art and Design and his MFA from the School of Visual Arts. He has a passion for storytelling and won a regional Emmy for Best Commercial Campaign in 2006. He's worked on promotions for clients including Coca-Cola, Disney, HBO, AT&T, Quicken Loans, and Jack Link's Beef Jerky. He's also served as creative director for the games division of Vectorform, creating titles for Xbox Live Arcade, iPhone, and Windows Phone. Thank you so much. And Nadine, if you want to go ahead and start.
So I wanted to start off today really with a Slido poll because this is an assessment presentation. So wanted to start off the day with a formative assessment. So if you just go to slido.com and put in the code 562439, or you can use your the QR code up on the corner, just tell us why you're here today. What about this session brought you here today? Is it the assessment topic, or just that you really wanted to have another Zoom presentation? And so formative assessment is a really quick way of getting feedback from your students, and it lets me know immediately what is going on with you. And so from what I can see right now, there's very little knowledge about assessment, or people are mostly curious about it. I do like the 10% that says they're assessment gurus, or 18% now. So if you are assessment gurus, feel free to kind of chime in and give us feedback on this presentation or assessment in general. The goal of the presentation today is really to introduce the overview of the assessment cycle, to show examples of the mechanisms of assessment, to explain how we have used assessment to impact our programs, and Kim and Ryan will be talking to you about that. And then just for us to have a conversation with you about assessment processes that you use. And really what we're doing with assessment is we're measuring student learning. So we talk about course outcomes and program outcomes, but it really is a reflection on the progress of student learning. And why is assessment important? Because we use assessment to collect information about a program's activities with the goals of making a judgment about a program, improving effectiveness, informing curricular or programming decisions. And when we do formative or summative assessment, we're learning what students know. Did they receive the information? And so what is the assessment process teaching us? When we assess program learning outcomes, we're really learning where we need to adjust learning goals and how to incorporate those goals at the course and the assignment level. So if you're familiar with the CCS assessment process, every course has course learning outcomes. Your course learning outcomes should be measurable, observable, specific, and should state what students are expected to learn in a course. For example, in our art history course at CCS, a learning outcome may be to define basic terminology of art history or identify particular works of art by artist and style. Those are learning outcomes that are specific and measurable at the end of that course. Those course learning outcomes should speak to the program learning outcomes. And program learning outcomes are the skills and competencies and really the big ideas that students should be able to articulate or put into action after the completion of a degree. A program is a set of courses that result in a degree. So when I finish this program, I'll be able to accomplish these items. And the program learning outcomes speak to the institutional learning outcomes. And these are, like the big ideas of the institution that really is the overall experience of the college. So whether it's courses, programs, student services, all the institutional learning outcomes would speak to that. So look at this curriculum map for advertising design. At the top, you'll see our institutional learning outcomes, which are think, create, communicate, innovate, and lead. And you'll see the program learning outcomes are mapped to the institutional learning outcomes. And then finally, all the courses that are listed here are mapped to the program learning outcomes. So if we're looking at that first program learning outcome, conduct research and synthesize critical thinking to develop strategies for solving marketing and creating transformative ideas. 5 of the ILOs are speaking to this specific program learning outcome. And you'll see on the courses down below that all of the courses down below are actually speaking to this research and synthesize critical thinking. They're speaking to that program learning outcome. So that is how we have the course mapped to the program, to the institutional learning outcome, and that's mapped in every program that we have at CCS. So once we know what our program learning outcomes are, this is basically a visual of the assessment cycle. So what we're doing here is we establish the goals, and we usually, the academic departments pick a program learning outcome at the beginning of the academic year so that they know what they're going to assess. And then they determine how we're going to assess that goals. Then you gather the information and you use that information to analyze it, look at it, and use that data for improvement. And we're just going to talk about each one of these processes in the assessment cycle. Okay, so when we set goals for the year, like I said, we ask the departments to measure one program learning outcome through the fall and the winter semesters. And the department chair is responsible for working with the faculty on measuring this outcome. And some of the overall questions that we want departments to consider are, what will students learn? What do you want to learn about the outcome? What questions are you asking that will help you know if this outcome is being addressed? And why is this important? What student work will you use? How will you evaluate the work? Who will participate? The program learning outcomes should be measurable. And you'll see the SMART goal here at the bottom. So 1 year illustration, the illustration department wanted to measure presentation skills. I'm not sure, Eric Olson may be here, but I don't know if Don Kilpatrick is today, but they wanted to measure presentation skills. So establishing a SMART goal like this was one way to do it. I'm not saying that they did this, but I know that they wanted to work on their presentation skills, but they could have said, okay, I want at least 80% of my illustration juniors to score 85% on their final presentation by May 15th. Everything there is measurable. And you know if that goal has been achieved. So I'm going to come back to that example in a minute. But once you have that goal, then you need to figure out how you're going to assess it. You know, what are the opportunities for assessment? We have formative assessment, and you can do formative assessment on the fly. You can ask students open-ended questions, ask students to reflect and write a journal entry. The poll that we did at the beginning of this presentation, when I finally got it going, that was a formative assessment. And this type of assessment is really helpful when you want quick feedback. If you want to give a quiz and the students don't do well, you realize that's an opportunity to review the material. On Zoom, it might be a little bit more difficult, but I could ask you to give me a thumbs up if I want to know that you understand what I'm saying. So, you know, I could say, hey, give me a thumbs up if you get what I'm saying. And that's a quick way to get a formative assessment. Summative assessment is the practice of evaluating what a student has learned at the end of a given period of time. So as course materials are provided, faculty members should evaluate how well that information is absorbed and retained. By assessing students at the end of a course or program, the summative assessment provides insight into how students have mastered the content. So remember the illustration example that I provided earlier. The faculty members measured presentation skills during the students' final review, and they discovered that in order to get presentation skills to where they wanted students to be at the senior level, they needed to embed that outcome in the curriculum at the freshman, sophomore, and junior levels. So evaluating students on a specific outcome at the end of the semester or year is really helpful that way. Okay, and so when you do that type of formative or summative assessment, then it's time to analyze and discuss the results, to look at the data. And generally, data collected for program level assessment fall into two categories: quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative data relies on numerical scores and ratings, and it's helpful in evaluation because it can provide quantifiable results that are easily able to calculate and display, while qualitative is primarily words, observations rather than numbers. This can come from a variety of sources, including survey questions, focus groups, essays, portfolios. Where you have qualitative and quantitative data, the most important thing is that the data is organized into a logical format that can be easily understood and analyzed. And honestly, we could have a whole conversation about data and how to analyze it. But the main questions that should pop out to you are, you know, are you getting answers to the right question? You know, what popped out at you? You know, will 80% of your students or 85% of the students meet the criteria for presentation skills? Is it obvious if they are not? Are the results consistent? Is the data consistent? There's a lot of questions that you can ask that helps you figure out if you're meeting your assessment goals. And that leads to, you know, whether the results are actionable and meaningful. Do results clearly tell you what students can or cannot do? Or are they absorbing the information? Just because you're teaching it doesn't mean that they're absorbing it. So how do you find out? You look at the data. Once you do that, then it's time to incorporate that data and make adjustments, right? So you can compare individual student scores with a larger group of students. So what's your benchmark for incoming freshmen? Where do you want them to be? Where's the starting point at? By looking at data, you can identify students that you can assist further. Identify students who need help with particular concepts. Maybe all of your students are doing well, but you've identified a small group of students that really need more assistance with perspective or some other aspect of your course. Reach out to them for extra help. Review those average scores to determine your own strengths and weaknesses as an instructor. Like, you know, you put it in the curriculum, but if they're not getting it, then you have to readjust and figure out, you know, how do they gain this content? So at the program level, incorporate findings into into the curriculum at every level. Once you find out what's going on, then you can adjust from the freshman to the senior level. You can adjust your curriculum accordingly. So in the illustration example, that's what they did with regard to illustration skills. And I think Kim and Ryan are going to give you some examples of how they adjusted their curriculum. All right, so because this is the end of my little portion, I'm just going to wrap this up. I have another little Slido poll here, but we went over assessment, and I just talked about the difference between the course learning outcomes, the program learning outcomes, and the institutional learning outcomes, and we hit the overall points of the assessment cycle. Once you establish the goals, then we usually do this at the beginning of the academic year, and it's good that we're speaking about it again at the end of the academic year, because you want to go into the fall semester kind of knowing what you have to do in terms of what goal you're going to assess and how you're going to do it. And then you gather that information and you use that information to make decisions about your program. The two things that we're doing here is what two items are part of the assessment cycle is we use the data for improvement and we set goals and objectives for the year. So if that's what you marked, you were correct. So I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to let Kim talk a little bit more extensive, a little more in depth about the crafts program and her assessment process in crafts.
Kim, you're muted, I think.
All right. Oops, present. Okay. All right. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm here to talk about assessment. I was so honored to be asked by Nadine to give this presentation. And assessment is actually something that I don't know if passion is a strong word, but that maybe I have a passion for, because I think it's something that allows us to articulate our highest ideals in our programs and then figure out how to make those intangible things tangible. For me, those are ideas that revolve around ideas of critical making, creativity, and independent thinking, and really finding processes to see how we can zero in on those things and evaluate them and cultivate them in our programs. So as far as an overview of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about a assessment process that we did in 2019. And I'll discuss how we created a review process that allowed us to evaluate our students and assess our program, and how we use that assessment data to enhance student learning and also continue to enhance assessment. So the first thing we did in this process is we wanted to identify a PLO from our program. So the PLO that we identified was articulate concepts, ideas, creative processes, and intentions within a personal, social, and historical context, visually, verbally, in presentations, and in writing. So there's quite a bit mashed into this single PLO. All of it's important, but it is a mouthful. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we measured these things, how we evaluated them, and also ways that we can improve on those measurements and evaluation. But again, I just want to underscore that I really believe that PLOs should be ambitious, idealistic, and authentic, and just say that, you can find a way to measure anything that is of value to you. And I think that that's just a critical starting point when you're thinking about PLOs for your program. From there, we developed a review process to evaluate this PLO. So this would be considered a summative assessment. And what we did was we had a senior artist talk. And what seniors did was they, at the beginning of the fall semester, they created a short presentation. It was about 10 minutes and I think it went to 15. where they talked about themselves, introduced their work, introduced their research and their conceptual themes for their senior exhibition, and then discussed their proposal for their senior exhibition. So this was a capstone it was a capstone project that everyone in the department, every senior in the department participated in, and every full-time instructor participated in evaluating. So it was not tied to a single class. And I do think that it is, you know, PLOs are things that require independent thinking. They signal an accumulation of knowledge and expertise. And I think that open-ended assignments, somewhat open-ended, can really assess students' ability to solve problems and think critically and creatively. When they're out in the real world and they have to give a presentation, they're going to get very simple instructions. Give me a presentation, give me a proposal. And so something open-ended can really see if students have the tools and skills to answer that in a compelling way once they leave school. So from there, we created a rubric that was mapped to our PLOs. And I think that rubrics are a really important tool in the evaluation and the assessment process. I think that rubrics really help instructors articulate the kind of specific outcomes that they need related to their PLO. I think it allows students to get very clear feedback. And I think it really helps evaluators be consistent overall after they see student after student and making sure they're all evaluating them on the same criteria. And it's just an important reference point in terms of figuring out what you're evaluating. So this is our PLO and how we mapped it to our rubric. So you can see the little arrows in terms of concepts, ideas, and creative processes and articulating those. It's mostly in the verbal presentation and imagery and content category. Personal, social, and historical context is more in verbal presentation and proposal. And then the visual, verbal, and presentation and writing kind of hits all 4 points. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I think if I had to revise this, I would use more specific language mapped to the PLO. And I would probably de-emphasize format and design and content and imagery. That's very visual, it's important, but right now it's taking up half of our rubric. And I think there's other things like personal, social, and historical context that could be emphasized more here. So, but this is what we used. And then we took this rubric into a Google form. So Google Forms are great. However, they're not very rubric friendly. And so our hack to do this was we took screenshots of the rubric and embedded it in the Google form as an image. And then we had a linear scale on the bottom that matched our rubric scores. And so, you know, we had those 4 sections of our rubric, and instructors scored each student on each of the 4 sections. And then there was a comment section at the bottom where every instructor left comments for the students as part of their assessment as well. So this ended up working really well. It's not a very elegant solution if you're a tech person, but it was a great workaround. And so what these Google Forms allowed us to do was to create a data set. So this data set is then used to evaluate students and to assess the program. And so this technology has allowed us really to collect data in a new way. So for those of you, who are not familiar, all the responses to your Google form ends up in this little Google Sheet icon, which you can then download as a CSV to create an Excel document. So it was important that I bring this data into Excel because that's what allowed me to create the charts and do the mail merge that I ultimately use this data for. There may be other ways to do it in Google Suite, but this is what we did. So what I got was this spreadsheet with all of the scores from all of the professors for each of the students and all of their comments. And what I did is for each student, I went in and made a combined row. So I had to do this manually. It took a little bit of time, but it was well worth it. I mean, it didn't take me more than an hour. And so creating this combined row was actually really important because it allowed me to get a single score in every area for every student. This was important for the review sheet because we needed an average score that could be mapped 1 through 5 to our rubric. It's also just a lot nicer for a student to get a single review sheet than to get 5 review sheets. It really allows them to get a better sense of where they stand within the program or within the rubric. It also really helps that each student has a single score when we process the data. So this was a little bit of a manual operation, but I think it was really important to do this part of things. And then from there, we used mail merge to create review forms. So I know a lot of people now are doing this in Form Builder. I haven't used Form Builder. Sarah Bate has and has done a great job with it. There might be a more elegant way to do this, but essentially what mail merge does is it allows you to populate a Google document with information from a spreadsheet. So we had this document that was every student, it automatically populated their name, the reviewers, all their scores, and all their comments. So every student gets this document at the end of the review process. It's really nice. I think they feel really accomplished. They get a whole bunch of feedback. They see where they score on the rubric. So it's a great tool for them. It's also a great tool for us to have conversations with students, to reference them, to come back to them later, to see what type of progress they're making in the program. So that is how we use the review process to evaluate our students. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we use that data to then assess the program. So the first thing is we know we're assessing the PLO, but we have to figure out specifically what do we want to assess. So a couple of things that we looked at is which students are excelling and who needs help. What are the strengths and weaknesses in each specific program area? And just a larger question of, are we cultivating excellence? So the way that we did this is we took this data and we made some charts. I'm not like an Excel or statistics pro. I just did a lot of tooling around, but eventually we did come up with some data that was really useful for us. So the first chart that was really helpful was just a ranking of students. And this isn't to be competitive, but I'll tell you a little bit about what this chart showed us. The first thing that this chart showed us is that we don't actually have anyone in the excellent category from this review. So that there's just sort of a lack of excellence in terms of really compelling presentations and reviews that are hitting all the points in our PLOs. The other thing that this told us is that there's a couple students in the unsatisfactory category, and those students need support and assistance. And so, when students are in a classroom and they get a low grade, that's just an interaction with a single instructor. Maybe they have a low GPA, but this doesn't really tell the whole story of their needs to the department. And what this assessment process allowed us to do was identify students that are struggling in a really clear way and communicate with one another and with the student in a really clear way about it. And so I think this was actually perhaps the most useful tool that came out of messing with the assessment data. From there, we looked at a couple other things. So these were our craft scores overall, and you can see that we have quite a few people, a majority of the people in the proficient category in every area, which is great. But that there is a little bit of excellence lacking. And you can also see that our verbal presentation was certainly the strongest. So, I mean, that's great that students are confident in presenting their work, but that the proposal, we only had one person in the excellent category. And then we broke out the data a little bit further. So one of the things we looked at is just what percentage of students score over a 3.5 average on the rubric. So we felt like this was important because that was kind of a threshold that we wanted every single person to be above. And we wanted to know how well we were doing with that. And we also broke out the average scores by section. We also wanted to see which sections were strong in what areas and how they could teach other areas about what they're doing, because all of these students are coming from different emphasis. They have a different major professor, different mentor. And so finding ways to see what we as faculty can share with one another. And ultimately, the conclusions that we drew were that they're proficient in most areas. Our weakest category is proposal. Our strongest is verbal presentation. But excellence is lacking overall, and we should continue really pushing students to develop presentations that are strong, clear, and verbally and visually engaging. So those were our conclusions. But I think it's really important to then gut check those conclusions, because I think the thing about assessment is basically you're creating a game and you're creating the rules. And it's very easy to create a game that you can win, that's already geared towards what you're already teaching. So I think just reflecting on those and saying, like, is our conclusions, is our data reflecting what we really in our gut experienced when we went to those presentations? And I think that the answer was yes. I think that, you know, what we felt as a faculty was that the presentations were decent, they were good, they were fine. They didn't change our lives. We would have loved to learn something we didn't know, to really get excited about student work, to be pulled in an engaging way. And I think we also felt like, although they were fine, we wish that there was more context and more grounding in historical and conceptual themes. And so from those observations and that data, we found different ways to enhance student learning on the one hand, and also change the assessment process on the other hand. So enhancing student learning, as I mentioned, had to do with one-on-one engagement around assisting low-performing students. It had to do with underscoring certain things in the curriculum, like the importance of social and historical context. And some of it had to do with just being really clear on what a great presentation would look like. In terms of the assessment process, we thought about, you know, changing the rubric language to better reflect the PLOs. As I mentioned, de-emphasizing just the slide aesthetics that was taking up a little too much space in the rubric. Allowing more time for each presentation. We felt that students didn't have enough time to really hit all the points we wanted them to hit. And then just revising the assignment sheet to be more clear and specific, so that the students are certain about what they should be presenting and giving us what we want. So that briefly is the story of our assessment process, and I look forward to your questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you. All right, let me stop my share. Hold on. Oh, I'm like stuck in a share. No, I'm not. Here I go. All right. Thank you.
All right, I'll jump in here now. Let me do the same thing. Give me 1 second. I gotta go to full screen and then share. All right, how are we doing? You can see that? All right, thumbs up. I like it. Thank you for having me, everybody. Amazing presentation so far. Great job, Nadine. Great job, Kim. I feel like what I'm going to present is going to be a little bit redundant in terms of the amazing technology and data that you guys see, but here we go. So equally weighted to student assessment are our course assessments. And we do these at the end of each semester with questions that are specific to the PLOs that we're assessing for the academic year. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about course learning outcome discussions and planning, then briefly about program learning outcome selection for assessment during the academic year. I'll move on to how we initiate the assessment through throughout the semester by utilizing Google Forms and surveying faculty. I'll discuss why we use Google Forms and then how we finalize the data. So at the beginning or prior to the beginning of each semester, we have a CLO's conversation with our instructors. So when preparing for each semester, we meet with individual faculty to discuss course learning outcomes, because doing so helps us with clarity on those outcomes and assures that the faculty understand each outcome. In this process, we also ask for faculty input. If they see the opportunity for different learning outcomes, we want to hear that. Because we bring in faculty there because they're subject matter experts, and we want to be sure they're involved in the process from the get-go. So if there are new CLOs that are implemented, we make sure they fit within our program learning outcomes, and then we move forward from there. So we utilize program learning outcomes in every facet of assessment to assure we're achieving the goals we've set for ourselves and for our students. Here are the program learning outcomes for advertising that you saw in Nadine's the beginning of the presentation. And as a department, we select typically 1, sometimes 2 to assess for the academic year. Once the selections are made, we begin formulating questions, building a Google form to share with our faculty at the end of the given semester. Excuse me, here is a sample of that form. And so the reason that we like using Google Forms for this process is the data collection. And you can see your data visualized in charts and graphs. And it gives us a nice snapshot of what we are excelling at and also where there may be some challenges. So as you see on this slide, oh, there it is. We've got some concerning answers from a particular course or courses. We've got a no and a been done before, which does not sound very positive. So just like Kim was stating, you can export these responses into an Excel sheet. I've redacted email addresses and course information for the safety and privacy of our instructors. So what this does is it then breaks down the responses per instructor, per course. And in this view, we can easily see which course those answers were submitted from. Luckily or not so luckily for us, in this case, it's the exact same course. So now that we have that data and the course is identified, we need to compare it to data that we've collected from year-end reviews and from student course evaluations. And then if those findings are consistent, we know that there are adjustments that need to be made. So we then regroup with the faculty member of that course to discuss opportunities for improvement and changes within the course. So collecting data in this way allows us to not only assess our program as a whole, but to assess and improve on an individual course level. So this compiled with the data that we're collecting from all of those other facets, the evaluations allow us to just keep our program at a high level for the students. So that's all for me. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ryan. So we have some time for discussion and questions. I saw that Kim already answered Julie's question in the chat about measuring excellence. I did want to note that Amy Roop made a comment about how she thinks of assessment. And so I just wanted to make sure everyone saw that. It was a little farther up. So some of the questions that Amy asks are, who is this assessment for? What is it designed to do? And what does the assessment value, which I think are great strategies as well. So I want to ask if anyone has questions for our speakers. Feel free to unmute yourself, or if you prefer to put something in the chat, I'm happy to read it out for you.
I can actually start off a question to Kim and Ryan, since they're my partners in crime here.
Great, thank you.
So we talked about institutional program course assessment. Are you able to achieve consistency in assessment from course to course in terms of grades? Like, what does an A mean from course to course, assignment to assignment? Do you have those discussions with faculty? Because we haven't gotten to that granular level yet. So I'm curious about how you do that in your departments.
Brian, do you want to go?
Yeah, we do. We have those discussions regularly. We're planning on having deeper discussions through this summer. We, in the process of setting up our year-end student reviews, really streamlined and simplified how we were looking at those, and we want to look at ways to do the same with our rubrics, so that it then does create a consistent format for grading. So it's less subjective, and then it's more consistent no matter the faculty that you put in there. So we're really looking at streamlining our rubrics to get that consistent data. If I'm looking at a student piece of work, or if any other faculty in the department are, we would come to the same conclusion, the same grade. So we're constantly assessing rubrics and discussing those, and that's part of the initial kickoff conversations that we have with faculty prior to the semester, is what each grade means and what we're looking for within each grade.
Yeah, for us, we don't have a lot of multiple sections. Most of our courses are taught in a single section. But I would say that for the ones that do have multiple sections, we actually don't take that approach. I think it's really important that instructors that sections have the same course learning outcomes, but I think it's really important that instructors have autonomy in terms of how their classes are taught and how they're evaluating students, because I think that so much of teaching, there's so much value in the kind of intangible and in between things that each individual instructor has to offer, that as long as we're able at a certain point to evaluate the learning outcomes of that course, perhaps it's just at the end of the year, it's evaluating the entire year. That consistency, I guess, isn't a real high priority for us.
Right. Thank you.
I have a question as well. While maybe other people are thinking of some questions to ask. So let's see. So you talked about some great strategies. In the library, we're huge fans of spreadsheets, so I was excited to see that. But I guess I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on what positive outcomes you've seen from changing departmental or course outcomes. So positive outcomes for your students or for your faculty by looking at that data and, pivoting what you're doing or tweaking what you're doing.
Well, I think that, Ryan, if you want to go, I'll let you.
No, I was just going to say we've used that data to adjust even what types of assignments we're giving, how long we're giving on assignments, and checked the quality output that we get from doing that as well. And we've talked with instructors about more chunking in their presentations and allowing, this is a drastic switch in topics, so let's give them time to digest and work with this area. Then at the second half of class, come back with another part of the lecture. So we've gone through and done a number of things for course improvement, and then the quality, or the jump in quality that we've seen from student output has been quite substantial. So we've gotten, we're in advertising, so there's a ton of award shows and things like that. So we're seeing a heavy growth in recognition in those shows and at a national and global level now, not just here regionally.
Yeah, I would say for us, I think a lot of our data confirmed a little bit what we already knew, but didn't really know, I guess. But I think that just the assessment process in and of itself, or I should say the evaluation process and the formal evaluation process, and that being given to students, has really inspired students, made them more accountable, made them more energized about their reviews and their presentations, and kind of added a level of rigor. So I can't say that we've made these really specific changes based on the data, but just the data in and of itself being collected, I think, has been significant in terms of accountability for students and for faculty.
Thank you.
I do think some of the information that we've seen come back on the assessment committee can surprise us. I may not get this right, Lisa, but I'm going to call it Lisa Catani and Liberal Arts. When they were doing their assessment project, I think the goal was to measure composition skills when students came in, and they thought that they would find our transfer students had more struggled with composition. But I think when the data came back, it was our CCS students. Was that what you were measuring?
Yeah.
Do you remember that project?
I do remember that project, Nadine. Thank you. This was the project where we were assessing, I believe, that 239 classes.
That's right. Was World.
Because that's the gateway class. That's the class that you need to have as a prereq for all of the upper level electives. So the performance in that class would indicate whether the student would be successful or have a good chance of being successful in those upper level electives. So we really wanted to put that one up under the microscope. Yeah. And, you know, the transfer students, yeah, we thought that that would be more of an issue, and it did not. It did not emerge as a big issue. We had other issues. We had issues of synthesizing citations, you know, of taking research and relating research to research in a compelling way. That kind of thinking process, that was the one that we really needed to work on. You know,
And that was surprising to you and to us. And so you were able to make adjustments with that outcome.
Yeah, and you know, it comes down to just sitting at a table and looking at the papers.
Right.
You know, getting a good representative sample together, a blind, you know, blind double reading. And just to say, if we're on the same page, what an A should look like, what a B should look like, and just to be sure
Right.
we're in agreement. That was really beneficial, I thought, too. That was part of the process. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing that that we know is that students like to know what an A looks like to them and what a B looks like to them. I think that if the more that we talk about assessment and we're familiar with the assessment process and we, you know, explain to them what an A looks like, what a B looks like, they can adjust accordingly based on that information on what they're being assessed on.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Question. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
Ashley, you have a question? Great. Go ahead. I didn't see you unmuted.
But I
Thanks.
don't know how exactly, I mean, it does pertain to this conversation. It's more of a personal interest. So have you, and I'm speaking specifically to Ryan and Kim, have you looked at the portfolios of students, say, who were graduating 15 years ago, and looked at the portfolios of current students and done a sort of apples to apples comparison? I mean, obviously, so much has happened in the last 15 years, right? We, as a college, we've undergone a huge transition with our priority being placed on assessment, but we have a different student population coming in with different skill sets right from the beginning. And, you know, there are so many changes in terms of courses and programs. You know this as well as I. And being able to look at the portfolios and see which students show the most, I don't know if promise is the right word, but which you would score higher, obviously accounting for differences in technology and time. That would be a really interesting comparison. Have you done that? And what, if you have, what have been your findings?
I think that would be fascinating. I don't know if we have access to those things or if we could do that, but I think it would just be a really interesting exercise to think about the evolution of the outputs of programs. But what I would also say is that I think it's really important to acknowledge that portfolios do not tell the entire story of student learning. It's just it's a single outcome, and I don't think it's a great indicator, actually. I think that, you know, a portfolio 5 years down the road might be a better indicator because I guess I can speak personally that when I look back at my college work, I mean, it sucked, to put it one way. You know, I don't think that it was super strong. I don't think I would evaluate it that way, but I don't think that is also a great indication of all the knowledge and skill and critical thinking that was like accumulated during that time. So I think it is something that's important to evaluate. Obviously, we wouldn't want to throw it out or not acknowledge it, but also to say that there's a lot of different things that we need to measure or look at or reflect on when it comes to really evaluating the depth of student learning and what people walk away with, because I think that it gets expressed over a lifetime. Do you know what I mean? And sometimes it's a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but that's, to me, what an undergraduate education is all about. And it needs to serve you far into the future in the long term as well as in the short term.
I have a collection of past student portfolios that we keep. We used to have them print and bind them, and we would get a copy. They would keep a copy at the end of the year. So we have stacks of older ones from a decade ago. And we've looked at that stuff. And I think the impact or the way we look at it is it has weight to it, but not as much, not as high a percentage on an impact of us changing things or looking at the evolution. We've looked at things in the past. Obviously, like you were saying, Ashley, technology has changed the quality of the students or their learning in high school before they get to us has changed drastically. So they're coming in with, greater skill set. That is something that we look at more than the output of the portfolio. So we've adjusted our curriculum to challenge them sooner in their education here at CCS than we have in the past. But looking at those portfolios, we would see things like, these are really great ideas, but the executions now are greater, and that's a result of what they're learning sooner, in high school or prior to high school before they get to us. So we've just made sure that we focused on them solving, these marketing problems and coming up with unique ideas, because they develop the craftsmanship, the design skill while they're here pretty heavily in other programs, foundation and liberal arts and things like that. So we really focus on, is it a unique marketing solution? And we compare that to apples to the past portfolios, because that's where the consistency for us is, right? So the ideas and what people are coming up with can be measured apples to apples. The executions, because technology and quality has changed so rapidly in the last decade, the last 5 years even, that's something that's more difficult for us to measure.
So thank you both very much. But I just have one follow-up question, and it sort of speaks to one of the questions that was offered in the chat about how do you measure excellence. And bouncing off what Kim had said in her earlier response, if you don't feel that the ending portfolio of a student is necessarily a measure of that student's promise or success to go forward, what would both of you think should be the thing that you look at to determine whether or not a student was successful in your program? Would it be 10 years out, what they're doing? Would it be like, what if you had your druthers and it had nothing to do with what was required? What would you choose as your barometer of success?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think maybe I would revise what I said earlier a little bit to say that I think that what is evaluated in portfolios needs to be evaluated carefully, maybe more so than it's not the best barometer. I mean, certainly I've seen that in high school portfolios, the high school student with the strongest portfolio isn't always the strongest student, because their portfolio reflects whatever, their access, their privilege, etc. But I think that actually looking 5 years or 10 years down the line, I don't know, maybe it's like a survey, honestly. Maybe it's not an output, is perhaps a better way to see if students have really felt the impact of their education or can articulate the value of it in that way. I think that would be a really interesting metric.
For us, the portfolio is a really heavy measure. It leads to those interviews that lead to employment. So, we're more business oriented department and very kind of in a different place at an art and design school, I think, where that is our end goal is that our students achieve employment, and that's how we measure success, that we're doing, something quote unquote right. So we look at how are they going to get a portfolio piece out of this class? What kind of challenges are we putting in front of them to help them make these unique concepts that are visually stunning, that will go in their portfolio, that will get them attention, that will earn them that job interview and hopefully help them land that job. So if portfolios were taken out of that as a measurable piece of the equation, then yeah, I would have to go, a few years down the road. And I think to Kim's point, a survey would be nice, or a conversation with them. What are they doing? How did they get there? And have those kind of reflections. And what was it, from CCS that helped influence that helped get them there? I'm not sure that I have a great answer outside of the portfolio. But yeah, I would like to have a conversation with the student and then just see what it is they're doing. If they're outside of advertising, what was it that made them follow a new path? And then if they're happy, I think the ultimate measure of success is, are you happy with what you're doing? Are you, do you have joy in creating whatever it is you chose to do? I don't know
Thanks.
how you would assess that though, other than the conversation, like, oh, you're happy with.
Thanks so much, Ryan and Kim and Nadine. We are about at time, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time today. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. I got a lot out of this. It was really great to hear about all the different assessment measures. I think even if we're not a faculty member, there is a lot to take away to bring back into our own departments. I would encourage you, if you didn't get a chance to ask your question, to follow up with our speakers, and we will resume our series in the fall. So I hope everyone has a really wonderful summer. And we're here in the library, so come visit us. We're here every day in the summer. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all.